In 1960, a strange little car from France was outselling almost every import in America. Only one competitor stood in front of it, the Volkswagen Beetle. Everything else, it left behind. It was tiny, it was underpowered, it looked like a soap bar on wheels, and Americans could not get enough of it. This is the story of the Renault Dauphine, a car that became the fastest rising import in the United States, sold through nearly 900 dealerships coast to coast, and then, in the space of a few short years, collapsed so completely that it became a punchline in car magazines for the next 50 years. You are going to hear real numbers, real sales figures, a real internal warning that was written down, filed away, and ignored until it was far too late. And by the end, you will understand why so many men who lived through that era still remember the day their neighbor's French car rusted through before the warranty even ran out. But first, you need to understand something. Before the Dauphine became a disappointment in America, it was a phenomenon in France, a genuine, record-breaking phenomenon. In 1957, the Dauphine did something no car had ever done in French history. It sold more than 100,000 units in a single year. No French nameplate had ever crossed that number before. Renault had built something the entire country wanted to drive. From 1957 through 1961, the Dauphine was the best-selling car in France, year after year. Production lines ran around the clock. At one point, Renault boasted that a new Dauphine rolled off the line roughly every 43 seconds. Think about that. Almost one full car, built every minute. The car was small, light, and cheap to run, exactly what a country still rebuilding after the war needed. It replaced the earlier Renault 4CV as the people's car of France, and it did the job brilliantly. So when Renault decided to bring the Dauphine across the Atlantic, the confidence made sense. If it could conquer France, why not America too? That decision would end up teaching the entire industry a lesson about the difference between winning a sales chart and winning trust. Stay with me, because what happened next is where this story turns interesting. To understand why Renault was so confident, you have to go back a little further to how this car was actually built. The man behind it was Pierre Lefaucheux, chairman of Renault after the war, working alongside an engineer named Fernand Picard. Their goal was simple to state and brutally hard to execute. Build a car ordinary families could actually afford, as a follow-up to the earlier Renault 4CV, which had already sold over 500,000 units by 1954. Renault did not rush this car to market. Engineers tested prototypes in Madrid for dry, dusty conditions, ran engine trials in Bayonne, took cars into the cold of Norway, and checked suspension and weather sealing across Sicily and the former Yugoslavia. All told, prototypes covered close to 1,250,000 miles of testing before the car reached a single showroom. At one point, engineers even lined up a prototype directly against a Volkswagen Beetle for comparison testing. They found the noise level too high, the ventilation inadequate, and the original engine underpowered. So they redesigned it, growing the engine to 845 cubic centimeters to give it a fighting chance. Even the color choices were researched. An early Renault survey found that many women buyers cared more about a car's color than its badge or model name. So Renault brought in a textile designer, Paul Marat, specifically to develop fresh, appealing color schemes for the Dauphine. It sounds small. At the time, it was genuinely modern market thinking, and it helped the car stand out on a crowded street. This was not a car thrown together to chase a trend. This was a car built with real engineering ambition behind it, and for a while, that ambition paid off spectacularly, and not only in France. The Dauphine went global. It was built under license in Italy by Alfa Romeo, which turned out close to 74,000 units of its own, before ending production in 1966. In Britain, Dauphines were assembled locally at a factory in Acton, specifically to get around import duties. The car was popular enough in the United Kingdom that it is believed to have been the first car ever advertised on British commercial television. Even Queen Elizabeth II was given a personal tour of a Renault factory in April of 1957, and the company presented her with a Dauphine of her own. By the time production finally ended in 1967, the Dauphine had been built in nearly a dozen countries, with total worldwide production crossing 2 million units, making it the first French car in history to reach that number. So, when the Dauphine arrived in America, it was not some unproven gamble. It was already one of the most successful cars Europe had ever produced. Which makes what happened next in the United States even harder to understand and even more important to learn from. When the Dauphine landed on American shores, Renault did not hold back. Nearly 900 dealerships across the country agreed to carry it. That is a serious commitment for a foreign automaker with almost no history in the United States market. The marketing was cheerful, almost playful. Advertisements featured balloons, bright colors, and a light-hearted tone that told buyers this was an easy, affordable, fun little car. No fuss. No pretension, just an economical way to get around. And it worked. In 1957, the first year, American buyers took home about 28,000 Dauphines. The following year, 1958, that number more than doubled to around 57,000. Time magazine even wrote that the Dauphine was the import climbing fastest in the American market that year. Then came 1959. 91,073 Dauphines were sold in the United States. Renault's best year. In America. Full stop. Dauphine. And it kept climbing. In 1960, more than 102,000 Dauphines were sold in the US. Compare that to Volkswagen, the segment leader, which sold around 130,000 Beetles that same year. The gap was closing. For one brief, shining moment, a French car looked like it might genuinely challenge the German import that had already built a reputation for toughness and dependability. Picture that. A small, odd-looking French sedan, with an engine in the back and a four-door body nobody else in its class offered, going toe-to-toe with the car that would eventually define reliable, affordable motoring for an entire generation of Americans. Before I go further into what happened next, if you are enjoying learning the real history behind cars like this, hit subscribe now. This channel digs into the stories the manufacturers themselves would rather you forgot, the numbers, the internal decisions, and the real reasons certain cars rose and fell. Subscribing means you will not miss the next one. Now, back to 1960. Renault was riding high, but underneath that success, cracks were already forming. Cracks that had nothing to do with sales charts, and everything to do with what happens to a car after the dealership hands you the keys and drives away. Here is the part nobody in Renault's American marketing department wanted to talk about. The Dauphine had two problems, and either one alone might have been survivable. Together, they were fatal. The first problem was rust. Real, aggressive, embarrassing rust. The body panels were built from thin, lightweight steel, which helped fuel economy, but did almost nothing to resist corrosion. In milder climates, owners might get a few good years before it became noticeable. But in the American Northeast, where roads get salted every winter, it was a different story entirely. Reports from the era describe Dauphines in New England losing their front-end structure to rust within a single winter, one full winter. That is not a slow decline. That is a car falling apart in front of its owner. Journalists joked, only half joking, that you could stand next to a parked Dauphine and actually hear it rusting. Decades later, in 2007, Time magazine looked back at automotive history and placed the Dauphine on its list of the 50 worst cars ever made. That is not a hot take from an angry blogger. That is one of the most respected news magazines in America, formally naming this car one of the worst ever sold. The second problem was performance, or the near total lack of it. The Dauphine's 845 cubic centimeter engine was not built for American highways, American distances, or American driving habits. Road and Track, one of the most trusted testing outlets in the business, clocked the Dauphine going from 0 to 60 miles per hour in 32 seconds. 32 seconds, not a typo. You could set a stopwatch, get up, make a cup of coffee, and still beat it to highway speed. Now here is where it gets worse. When something breaks on a car, you need parts, and you need mechanics who know what they are doing. Renault's American dealer network, despite its size on paper, simply was not equipped for the volume of repairs coming in. Simple fixes that should have taken an afternoon were taking weeks. Owners were left waiting, frustrated, carless, while parts made their way across an ocean. Renault had built enough dealerships to sell the car. It had not built enough infrastructure to support it once it was sold. That gap between selling and servicing is exactly where trust goes to die. And once American buyers lose trust in a brand, getting it back is nearly impossible. But the most damning part of this story is not the rust, and it is not the 32 seconds to 60. It is what happened inside Renault's own American offices, years before any of this became public knowledge. Here is a strange footnote to this story that most people have never heard, and it tells you something about how much raw potential this little car actually had, even while its reputation was falling apart. An American industrialist named C. Russell Feldman ran a company called National Union Electric, the parent business behind the Exide battery company, the Eureka vacuum cleaner brand, and a coach builder called Henny. Feldman believed an electric car could generate serious publicity for his businesses, and he looked at the Dauphine's layout, light body, rear-mounted engine bay, and saw the perfect donor vehicle. He ordered 100 Dauphines shipped to him with no engines or transmissions installed at all, just empty rear compartments, waiting to be filled. His engineers packed 12 6-volt batteries into each car and built a simple dashboard switch to select forward or reverse, no gearbox required. They called it the Renault Dauphine Kilowatt. It was slow, even by Dauphine standards. Top speed of 35 miles per hour, a range of about 40 miles, before the batteries needed recharging. The batteries themselves needed replacing roughly every 2 years. It was never going to replace the family car in most driveways. But think about what that project actually proves. Here was a serious American businessman, in an era decades before anyone was seriously talking about electric vehicles, looking at the Dauphine's basic platform and deciding it was good enough to build an entirely new kind of car on top of. The bones of the Dauphine were not the problem. The execution, the rust protection, the parts supply, the service network, that is where everything fell apart. It is almost a perfect summary of this whole story in miniature. A promising idea, genuine engineering underneath it, undone by the details nobody wanted to take seriously until it was too late. Renault did try to course correct. Starting around 1963, the company brought more solidly built and more powerful models into the American market, hoping to repair the damage. But the timing was against them. The Dauphine's reputation had already sunk in, and the buying public does not forget easily. It was, in the end, too little, arriving far too late. This is the detail that changes the whole story. Somewhere inside Renault's American operation, in the years when the Dauphine was still selling well, a young employee sat down and wrote an honest, unflinching report. He laid out exactly what was going wrong: the rust, the lack of parts, the service delays, the mismatch between the car and the American driver. Everything that would eventually sink the Dauphine's reputation. This young man saw it coming, in writing, years in advance. That young employee would later rise through the ranks and eventually become the president of Renault. But at the time, nobody with the power to act on his warning bothered to read it properly. The report was filed away, forgotten, left in a drawer, while the sales figures kept climbing, and everyone assumed the good times would simply continue. They did not continue. By some accounts, entire shipments of unsold Dauphines were sent back across the Atlantic because American buyers had simply stopped wanting them. Picture that. Cargo ships loaded with brand new cars, turning around because the demand that used to be there had evaporated. And the sales numbers tell the rest of the story with brutal clarity. In 1960, Renault was selling over 100,000 cars a year in the United States. By 1970, just 10 years later, that number had collapsed to roughly 5,000 cars annually. Not a decline, a collapse, a 95% drop in one decade. Years after the disaster, When French executives finally traveled to America to investigate what had gone wrong, someone found that old report buried in the archives. The young man who wrote it had predicted almost everything. Nobody had listened. And the damage did not stop with Renault. A phrase took root in the American consumer psyche during those years. The idea that French cars, as a category, simply could not be trusted. That sentiment did not fade quickly. It followed French manufacturers for decades, making it harder for Renault, and later Peugeot, to ever fully win back the American buyer. Peugeot would eventually pull out of the American market entirely by the early 1990s, still carrying some of the weight of a reputation problem that started with a small, rusting sedan from the 1960s. One report, one warning, ignored, and an entire country's opinion of French engineering changed for a generation. So what do you actually take away from the Renault Dauphine? It is tempting to look at this story and just laugh at a funny little French car that rusted too fast and drove too slow. But underneath the jokes, there is a lesson that applies to a lot more than automobiles. A sales chart can lie to you. For 3 straight years, the Dauphine's numbers in America looked like a success story, climbing every year, beating expectations. And the whole time, the foundation underneath that success, the reliability, the service network, the actual experience of owning the car day to day, was quietly falling apart. Nobody wanted to look at it because the sales figures felt too good to question. That is the real warning here. When something is growing fast, it is easy to assume the growth itself is proof that everything underneath is solid. It rarely is. The Dauphine sold well because the marketing was clever and the price was right. It failed because nobody backed that marketing up with a car and a support system that could actually earn long-term trust. And somewhere in a filing cabinet, a young man had already written the warning. Nobody read it in time. If you ignore the person telling you the truth early, you do not avoid the problem. You just delay it, and it comes back bigger. Renault eventually came back to America, years later, wiser, more careful, trying to rebuild what the Dauphine had broken. But that first impression, the rust, the breakdowns, the 32 seconds to 60, stayed in the American memory for decades. Some reputations take one bad car to build and a generation to undo. If this kind of story does what history should do, pull back the curtain on what the manufacturers never wanted you to know, then make sure you are subscribed to this channel. We go deep into stories like this every week. The real numbers, the real internal decisions, the cars that rose and fell for reasons most people never hear about. Drop a comment below and tell me what stuck with you most. Was it the rust, the 32-second sprint to 60, or that forgotten report sitting in a drawer while the whole thing came apart? I read every one of them. And if you know someone who remembers these cars, a father, an uncle, an old friend who owned imports back in that era, share this with them. Give this video a like if you enjoyed it. It genuinely helps this channel keep telling stories like this one. Thank you for watching. I will see you in the next one.